In Texas, we have a saying, "Don't start a war you're not strong enough to finish." Karen Beaumont, president of the Silverwood Estates HOA, should have remembered that before she pulled up to my farm gate in her fire-engine red Porsche 911. She wanted a shortcut through the 52 acres my family had been working since 1947, all to save herself an 8-mile detour. I said no. She threatened me, and when I told her, "My land, my rules," her eyes went red like she was about to explode. 3 days later, she cut my lock and parked that Porsche right in the middle of my entrance like a dare. She screamed, "You touch my car, I'll sue you for $500,000. So I didn't touch it. I just took it apart, every single piece. And the next morning, when she came back to find her Porsche stripped down to a bare chassis, that's when the real war started. But before I get into all that, let me know where you're watching this from and what time it is for you right now. It was a Tuesday afternoon, late May, and the Texas heat was already pressing down like a wet blanket by 4:30 p.m. I was out by the fence line fixing a section that had come loose during the last storm when I heard the engine. Not just any engine, a Porsche Turbo, the kind that announces itself 300 yards before it arrives. I looked up and saw the red blur slowing as it approached my property. The gate had stood at the entrance to Lone Oak Farm for longer than I'd been alive, right under a sign that made things clear: private property, no trespassing, Texas Penal Code 30-05. Every neighbor, every delivery driver, every county official had respected it without question for 78 years. The Porsche stopped, the door opened, and out stepped Karen Beaumont, 55 years old, blonde hair pulled back tight, designer sunglasses bigger than her face, and an expression that could curdle milk. I knew who she was. Everyone in the area knew Karen. She'd been HOA president of Silverwood Estates for 6 years and had made herself legendary for measuring mailbox heights and fining neighbors if their grass was 3.2 inches instead of 3. The kind of person who thrives on control. I set down my tools and walked toward the gate, wiping my hands on my jeans. She was already standing there, one hand on her hip, the other shielding her eyes from the sun. No hello, no smile. She just looked at me like I was a problem that needed solving and said, "Open the gate. I need to cut through your property." I stopped about 10 feet from the fence and took a breath. My father taught me a long time ago that the first response sets the tone for everything that follows. Stay calm, stay polite, and never let anger make your decisions. So I nodded and said, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Beaumont. I'm afraid I can't do that. This is private property. The public road is that way." And I pointed west, toward the county highway. She pulled off her sunglasses and stared at me like I'd just told her the earth was flat. "Excuse me, do you know who I am?" I nodded. "Yes, ma'am. You're the HOA president of Silverwood Estates." She smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who's used to getting her way. "Then you should know I have authority in this area. I need access through your land to avoid an 8-mile detour. It's a reasonable request." I kept my voice steady. "Mrs. Beaumont, with all respect, you don't have authority here. This farm is outside the boundaries of your HOA. It always has been." Her smile disappeared. Her jaw tightened. "That's ridiculous. This whole area falls under Silverwood jurisdiction." I shook my head. "You see that sign, private property, owned by my family since 1947. If you need directions to the highway, I'm happy to help, but I can't let you through." For a second, she just stood there, breathing hard through her nose like a bull getting ready to charge. Then she stepped closer to the gate, close enough that I could see the little veins in her eyes turning red. "You think you can tell me no? I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I decide what's reasonable in this community." I stayed where I was, hands loose at my sides, voice calm as Sunday morning. "Mrs. Beaumont, this farm is not part of your community. You have no authority here. This is my land, my rules." That was the moment. The moment everything shifted. I saw something crack behind her eyes. Her face went pale, then flushed red, and her hands balled into fists. "What did you just say?" I repeated it, slower this time. "My land, my rules," she exploded. "How dare you? You have no idea who you're dealing with. I will make your life a living hell. I will call the county. I will call the board. I will make sure you regret this." I didn't move, didn't raise my voice, just waited for her to finish. When she finally ran out of steam, I said quietly, "Mrs. Beaumont, you're free to call whoever you want, but the answer's still no." She stared at me for another 5 seconds, breathing hard, then turned on her heel, marched back to her Porsche, got in, and slammed the door so hard I'm surprised the glass didn't crack. The engine roared to life, and she peeled out, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after she was gone. I stood there for a minute, watching the dust settle, then walked back to the fence and picked up my tools. My hands were steady. My heartbeat was normal, but something in my gut told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and thought about my father. He'd worked this land for 40 years before handing it to me. He'd taught me how to read the sky, how to fix a tractor, how to know when a fence line was weak before it broke. But more than that, he'd taught me something about respect. "Garrett," he used to say, "land is the foundation of freedom. You protect it with the law, not with your fists. The law is the only thing standing between us and chaos." I thought about that as I looked out over the fields, the same fields my grandfather had plowed in the 1950s, the same fields I'd worked since I was 16. This wasn't just dirt. This was legacy, and I'd be damned if I let some HOA tyrant roll over it just because she was used to getting her way. I finished my coffee, went inside, and made a note to call my attorney in the morning. If Karen Beaumont wanted to play by the rules, then we'd play by the rules, all of them. 2 days later, the letter arrived. Not hand-delivered, not slipped under my door. It came certified mail, the kind that requires a signature and makes sure there's a paper trail. I opened it over breakfast and read it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining things. It was from the law office of Marcus Finley, attorney at law, representing the Silverwood Estates Homeowners Association. The language was formal and threatening in equal measure. It demanded that I cease obstructing the lawful right-of-way for HOA residents and provide gate access for vehicles when required. It threatened fines of $1,000 per violation and hinted at further legal action if I failed to comply. I set the letter down next to my coffee and stared at it for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone and called Robert Hayes, the real estate attorney I'd used when I refinanced the farm 3 years ago. He answered on the second ring, and I explained the situation. There was a pause. Then he said, "Garrett, let me look into this. Don't respond to anything yet. I'll call you back in an hour." He called back in 45 minutes. "Good news," he said. "Your farm is 0.4 miles outside the Silverwood HOA boundary. I pulled the official plat maps from the county clerk's office. They have zero authority over your property. Zero. That letter is nothing but hot air." I felt a small knot in my chest loosen, so I'd just ignore it. Robert laughed. "You can frame it if you want, but yeah, legally speaking, they've got nothing. However, Garrett, let me give you some advice. People like this don't stop just because the law says no. If she's willing to threaten you in writing over something this ridiculous, she's not going to back down quietly. Keep records of everything, every interaction, every letter, every conversation. If this escalates, you're going to want a paper trail." I thanked him and hung up. Then I took a photo of the letter, saved it to a folder on my computer, and filed the original in my desk drawer. If Karen wanted to escalate, I'd be ready. That afternoon, around 4 p.m., I heard the Porsche again. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 other people got out with her. A man in his 60s wearing a polo shirt and khakis, and a woman about Karen's age in a blazer that looked too formal for a farm visit. They stood at the gate, and Karen didn't wave or shout this time. She just stood there with her arms crossed, staring at me like she was daring me to come closer. I walked out slowly and stopped on my side of the fence. Karen gestured to the 2 people beside her without taking her eyes off me. "This is the HOA board. We've come to inform you that we've made a decision. You will grant an easement for Silverwood residents to use this access road. It's in the best interest of the community." I looked at the man, then at the woman, then back at Karen. Her expression was icy, controlled, like she'd rehearsed this. "I spoke with my attorney this morning. He confirmed what I already knew. You have no jurisdiction here." Karen's smile was thin and sharp as a knife. "Your attorney is misinformed. I suggest you get a second opinion before you find yourself in very expensive trouble." The man in the polo shirt cleared his throat. "Look, we're not trying to cause trouble. We just think it's reasonable to ask for access. It would benefit everyone." I nodded. I understand, but the answer is still no. Karen's smile disappeared. She leaned in closer to the gate, her voice dropping to something colder and more deliberate. You don't know who you're dealing with. I don't lose, Mr. Stone. Not to stubborn old men who think a fence makes them kings. You wait 1 week. That's all you have. 1 week, and you'll be begging me for mercy. She turned without another word and walked back to her car. The man and woman exchanged awkward glances, then followed her. The man paused and looked back at me, lowering his voice. She's already sued 4 other neighbors in the last 2 years. Small things, mailboxes, fences, all of them lost thousands in legal fees. You should be careful, I asked quietly. Then why do you stay on the board? He glanced back at Karen's car. Fear. She makes life unbearable if you cross her, but you're outside the HOA. That's different. She's not used to people she can't control. He walked back to the car, and they drove off. I stood there for a moment, then went back inside and sent Robert an email with a full summary of what had just happened. Then I did something I'd been considering since yesterday. I called a security company and scheduled an installation for 4 high-definition cameras to cover the gate and entrance, if Karen was planning something. I wanted every second of it on video. That evening, I sat on the porch and pulled up the county court records on my phone. It didn't take long to find them. 4 civil cases were filed by Karen Beaumont in the last 2 years. 1 over fence height, 1 over the mailbox color, 1 over tree trimming, 1 over the driveway width. 3 had been dismissed. 1 had settled out of court. But in every case, the defendant had racked up legal fees between $15,000 and $30,000 just to defend themselves. I stared at the screen for a long time. This wasn't about an 8-mile detour. This was about power. Karen Beaumont didn't just want access to my land. She wanted to prove that no one could tell her no, and that made her more dangerous than I'd thought. I set the phone down and looked out over the fields. My father's words came back to me. The law is the only thing standing between us and chaos. If Karen wanted chaos, I'd meet her with the law, every step of the way. 4 days after the second visit, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. to the sound of metal cutting through metal. I knew that sound. I'd heard it before when thieves tried to break into my workshop 2 years back. Bolt cutters. I threw on my jeans and boots and walked outside into the pre-dawn gray. My gate lock had been cut clean through, and sitting in the middle of my entrance road, blocking the entire path like a bright red barricade, was Karen Beaumont's Porsche 911. She was standing next to it, arms crossed, wearing workout clothes and an expression that was unnervingly calm. When she saw me, she didn't shout or threaten. She just said in a flat, matter-of-fact tone, "Good morning, Mr. Stone. I told you that you had 1 week. I decided not to wait. This car stays here until you cooperate." I walked toward the gate slowly, keeping my breathing steady, my hands loose. Every instinct in my body wanted to react, to shout, to demand she move the car immediately. But my father's voice was in my head again. Stay calm, stay legal, don't give them ammunition. I stopped about 10 feet from the fence and looked at the cut lock, then at the Porsche, then at Karen. "Mrs. Beaumont, you're trespassing on private property. You cut my lock. You need to move your vehicle and leave immediately." She tilted her head slightly, almost like she was bored. "This is a public easement now. I filed the paperwork with the county last week. This road is open access." I shook my head. "That's not how easements work. Even if you filed something, which I doubt, it takes months to process. You don't have permission to be here." She stepped closer to the Porsche and rested her hand on the hood. "Here's what's going to happen. This car stays right here. And if you so much as touch it, I will sue you for $500,000 in damages. This vehicle is worth $180,000, and I have witnesses who will testify that you threatened me." I stood there for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air. Then I pulled out my phone and called Sheriff Powell. He arrived 20 minutes later, and I explained the situation while Karen stood next to her car with that same unsettling calm. Sheriff Powell looked at the cut lock, looked at the Porsche, then looked at Karen. "Ma'am, this property is outside the HOA boundary. You're trespassing. I need you to move your vehicle." Karen didn't flinch. "I'm exercising my right of access. If he tries to move my car, I'll file charges for destruction of property." Sheriff Powell sighed and turned to me. "Garrett, legally speaking, she's trespassing, But if you move her car without going through the proper procedure, she could sue you. Texas property code says you can remove trespassing property, but you have to give notice first, 24 hours. I nodded. What kind of notice? He pulled out a notepad and wrote something down. Written notice. Certified if possible. Tell her she has 24 hours to remove the vehicle. After that, you have the right to take reasonable measures to remove it. Karen's calm finally cracked. Just a flicker. Reasonable measures. What does that mean? Sheriff Powell looked at her evenly. It means whatever Mr. Stone deems necessary to clear his property, as long as he doesn't cause unnecessary damage. He tipped his hat to me and walked back to his cruiser, the moment he drove off. I pulled out my phone and composed an email to Karen's address, which I'd saved from the HOA letter. The subject line read, Notice of Trespassing Vehicle, 24-hour removal requirement. I attached photos of the cut lock and the Porsche blocking my entrance. I wrote, Mrs. Beaumont, your vehicle is unlawfully parked on private property. You have 24 hours from the time of this email to remove it. Failure to comply will result in the vehicle being dismantled and stored at your expense. Per Texas Property Code. Chapter 30, Section 5. I hit send, then turned to Karen and said quietly, You have 24 hours. This is the last time I'm going to warn you. She stared at me for a long moment. Then her lips curled into something that almost looked like a smile. You don't have the guts. You're just a farmer playing pretend. Then she turned and walked off down the road on foot, leaving the Porsche exactly where it was. 24 hours passed. No call, no email, no apology. At 6 a.m. the next morning, I walked out to my workshop and opened the doors. Inside was every tool I'd accumulated over 15 years working as an aerospace mechanical engineer at Boeing. Hydraulic jacks, impact wrenches, precision socket sets. I'd spent a decade taking apart jet engines and putting them back together with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. A Porsche 911 was just another machine. I pulled out my phone, opened the camera app, and set up 3 angles to record everything. Then I put on my work gloves, my safety glasses, and my old Boeing coveralls, and I got to work. I started with the hydraulic floor jack, lifting the car onto 4 jack stands. Then I removed all 4 wheels, each one a Pirelli P0, labeled and set on wooden racks. Next came the mirrors, headlights, and bumpers, all disconnected carefully and stored. I worked methodically, the way I'd been trained. Every bolt cataloged. Every component was photographed before removal. By mid-morning, I'd removed the windshield using a specialized cutting wire. 2 hours later, the hood, trunk lid, and both doors were off. I pulled the seats, disconnected the steering wheel after disabling the airbag, and drained the coolant into a proper containment drum. By 2 p.m., the Porsche 911 that had been parked arrogantly in my driveway was now just a bare chassis sitting on jack stands, surrounded by neatly organized parts. Every single component was intact, labeled, photographed, and stored in my garage. Not a scratch, not a dent, not a single piece was damaged. I stepped back, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and looked at the work. It had taken me 8 hours, and every second of it was on video. I walked inside, downloaded the footage, backed it up in 3 places, and sent a summary email to Robert Hayes with the subject line, Documentation complete. Then I sat down on my porch with a cup of coffee and waited. It didn't take long. At 4:30 p.m., I heard a car pull up. Then I heard the scream, and that's when Robert called me with news I hadn't been expecting. Garrett, I found something. Karen and her husband own a development company, Beaumont Development LLC. They're trying to build 120 luxury homes on the other side of your property. If they get a road through your land, the project value goes up by $3.2 million. I looked out at the bare chassis and smiled. Well, that explains a lot. 2 days after I dismantled the Porsche, the lawsuit arrived. Karen was suing me for $500,000 in damages. The complaint listed $180,000 for the vehicle's value, $50,000 for reassembly costs, $100,000 for emotional distress, and the rest for loss of reputation and personal humiliation. Her attorney was Marcus Finley, the same name from the HOA threat letter, and the language was aggressive and absolute. It painted me as a vindictive property owner who'd destroyed a luxury vehicle out of spite and malice. I read it twice, then called Robert Hayes. He told me to come to his office that afternoon and bring every piece of documentation I had. When I arrived at 3 p.m., he was already laying out a strategy on his conference table like a general preparing for war. Robert looked up when I walked in and gestured to a chair. "Garrett, this is going to be ugly, but we have everything we need to win." Karen made a critical mistake. She escalated this into court, and now everything becomes public record. That means we get to pull back the curtain on all of it. I sat down and watched as he opened a folder. Inside were printed emails, screenshots, property maps, and a timeline he'd been building since my first call. "First," he said, "we prove you acted within the law. You gave her 24 hours notice. You documented everything. You didn't damage a single part. Every piece of that Porsche is sitting in your garage, intact and cataloged. That kills her destruction of property claim." He slid a stack of photos across the table. They were stills from my video, showing each step of the disassembly in perfect detail. "Second, we destroy her credibility by showing motive. That's where it gets interesting." He opened his laptop and turned it toward me. On the screen was a business registration document for Beaumont Development, LLC. Owners listed Donald Beaumont, 65%, and Karen Beaumont, 35%. Below that was a county permit application for a new access road, filed 6 months earlier. The proposed route cut directly through the area near my farm. Attached to the application was a financial impact statement. "This is the smoking gun," Robert said. "If they get a road through or near your property, their development project increases in value by an estimated $3.2 million. It also reduces their infrastructure costs by $800,000. Karen wasn't trying to save 8 miles on her commute. She was trying to strong-arm you into giving up access so her company could profit. Her husband, Donald, is listed as the primary contractor for the road project. This whole thing was a shakedown." I stared at the numbers on the screen. 3.2 million. Suddenly, everything made sense. The aggression, the refusal to back down. The Porsche was planted in my driveway like bait. This wasn't about pride. It was about money. Robert leaned back in his chair. "I also contacted 2 of her previous targets. They've agreed to provide affidavits about Karen's harassment tactics. One of them is Thomas Reed. He spent $18,000 defending himself against her before she dropped the case. He's willing to testify that this is her standard operating procedure." I looked at Robert and said quietly, "So we're not just defending me, we're exposing her whole system." Robert nodded. "Exactly. And that's what's going to end this." The pre-trial hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. When the day came, I walked into the county courthouse in a pressed shirt and my cleanest boots. Karen was already there with Marcus Finley, sitting at the plaintiff's table in a navy blazer and pearls, looking every bit the respectable HOA president. She didn't look at me when I sat down. The judge, a woman in her early 60s named Judge Sullivan, called the hearing to order and asked both sides to present their preliminary arguments. Marcus Finley stood first. He painted a picture of me as a hostile, uncooperative landowner who had destroyed Karen's property in retaliation for a simple request. He showed photos of the stripped Porsche chassis and called it evidence of brutal, malicious vandalism. He described Karen as a concerned community leader trying to improve access and safety for residents, only to be met with aggression and destruction. When he finished, Judge Sullivan turned to Robert. "Mr. Hayes, your response." Robert stood and opened his briefcase. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's claim rests on false premises. My client did not destroy her vehicle. He followed Texas property code to the letter after she trespassed and refused to leave. But more importantly, this lawsuit is not about a car. It's about financial leverage." He placed a USB drive on the bailiff's desk. "This contains 8 hours of video documentation showing my client carefully disassembling the plaintiff's vehicle without causing any damage. Every part is intact, labeled, and stored." Then he placed the business registration and permit application on the projector. The documents lit up the screen in sharp detail. Beaumont Development, LLC, permit application for access road. Financial impact analysis, $3.2 million value increase, an $800,000 cost reduction. Donald Beaumont listed as the primary contractor. Your Honor, the plaintiff and her husband own a development company seeking to build 120 luxury homes. This project depends on access through or near my client's land. Mrs. Beaumont has spent months trying to pressure, threaten, and intimidate my client into granting that access. When he refused, she escalated to trespassing and then filed this lawsuit to bleed him financially. This is not a dispute about a vehicle. This is a calculated harassment campaign with a $3.2 million motive. The room went silent. Judge Sullivan leaned forward and looked at Karen. Mrs. Beaumont, did you disclose this conflict of interest to the court? Karen's face went pale. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out for a second. Then she stammered, That's a separate business matter. It has nothing to do with— Judge Sullivan cut her off. It has everything to do with motive, Mrs. Beaumont, and it raises serious questions about the legitimacy of this claim. Mr. Hayes, I'm going to need time to review this evidence. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks. She looked at Karen one more time, and her expression was cold. I suggest you use that time wisely. As we walked out of the courthouse, Robert put a hand on my shoulder. That went better than I expected. But Garrett, there's something else you should know. There's an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for next Friday. A lot of Silverwood residents are asking questions about Karen now. They want answers, and they want to hear your side. I looked at him. I'm not part of that HOA. Robert smiled. No, but you're the one she's been targeting. They've invited you to speak. It's your chance to tell the whole story in front of the people she's supposed to be serving. If you want this to end, that's where it happens. I thought about it for a moment, then nodded. Then I'll be there. The emergency HOA meeting was held on a Friday night at 7 p.m. in the Silverwood Estates Community Center. When I pulled up, the parking lot was nearly full. I counted at least 60 cars, which for a community of 85 homes meant this wasn't just well attended. It was standing room only. People were angry, confused, and demanding answers. I walked in through the back entrance like Robert had suggested, and he met me in the hallway. They're waiting for you, he said quietly. Karen's already up there trying to control the narrative. She's telling them you're a threat to the community, that you destroyed her property, that you're unstable. But the room isn't buying it. Half of them have already seen the court documents. I nodded and followed him into the main hall. The room fell silent the moment I walked in. Karen was standing at the front near a podium, microphone in hand, mid-sentence. She froze when she saw me, and for just a second, her mask slipped. I saw something close to panic. Then she straightened, forced a smile, and said into the microphone, "This is a private HOA meeting. Mr. Stone is not a member of this community. He has no right to be here." A woman in her 60s, sitting in the third row, stood up. I recognized her from Robert's notes. Helen Marsh, one of the longest-serving residents of Silverwood. Actually, Karen, we invited him. 15 of us signed a petition under the HOA bylaws to allow him to speak. He has a right to respond to your accusations, especially since you've been making them in his name for weeks. Karen's smile faltered, but she stepped aside. Helen gestured to me. "Mr. Stone, the floor is yours." I walked to the front of the room, and Robert handed me a small remote. I clicked it, and the projector screen behind me lit up with the official plat map, showing the boundary of Silverwood Estates HOA, with my farm clearly marked 4 miles outside the line. "Good evening," I said. "My name is Garrett Stone. Most of you know why I'm here. Mrs. Beaumont has claimed I'm obstructing the community and destroying her property out of spite. I'm here to show you the truth." I clicked to the next slide. The business registration for Beaumont Development LLC filled the screen. Owners listed Donald Beaumont, 65%, Karen Beaumont, 35%. The room went completely silent. This is the company Mrs. Beaumont and her husband own. They're developing 120 luxury homes on the other side of my property. If they get a road through my land, the project value increases by $3.2 million. I let that number hang in the air. Her husband, Donald, is the primary contractor for that road. This was never about convenience. It was about profit. I clicked again, and the permit application appeared, showing the proposed road route and the financial impact analysis. This permit was filed 6 months before Mrs. Beaumont ever knocked on my gate. She's been planning this the whole time, and when I refused to give up my property rights, she escalated. She trespassed. She sued me for $500,000, all while using her position as HOA president to make it look legitimate. I turned and looked directly at Karen. "Mrs. Beaumont, did you ever tell the board about this conflict of interest? Did you tell them you had a $3.2 million reason to target me?" Karen stepped forward, and for the first time, her voice wasn't sharp or controlled. It was shaking. That's completely out of context. Yes, we own the company, but that doesn't mean this was about community benefit, about improving access for everyone here. Not just, a man in the back row stood up. You sued me over my mailbox color, cost me $18,000 in legal fees. Was that for the community? Two, another voice. You fined me 3 times for grass height. Now I'm wondering what I was really being punished for. Karen's face flushed, and she held up both hands like she was trying to physically stop the wave of anger building in the room. Please, everyone, just listen. You're letting him manipulate you. He's an outsider. He doesn't understand what it takes to manage a community like this. I've worked for 6 years to keep property values high, to maintain standards, to make sure this place stays desirable. That development project, it would have raised your home values by 15%. 15. I was trying to help all of you. Her voice cracked slightly, and I realized she wasn't angry anymore. She was desperate. She was watching her control slip away in real time and scrambling to grab it back. But the room wasn't listening. Helen Marsh stood again. Karen, you used your authority as president to threaten a man who isn't even part of this HOA. You did it to benefit your private business. That's not leadership. That's corruption. Karen's desperation flared into something sharper. Corruption. I built this community. I've spent 6 years dealing with complaints, managing violations, keeping order, while the rest of you just sat back and criticized. And now you're turning on me because of one man who refused to cooperate. The room erupted. Voices overlapped, shouting questions, accusations, demands. Karen stood at the front, breathing hard, her hands trembling. Then she looked at me, and her voice dropped to something low and venomous. You did this. You turned them against me. You and your land and your rules. I looked back at her, calm as I'd been since the day she first showed up at my gate, and said quietly, No, Mrs. Beaumont, you did this. Every choice was yours. Helen's voice cut through the noise. I move for an emergency vote to remove Karen Beaumont from the position of HOA president, effective immediately, on grounds of conflict of interest and abuse of authority. A dozen hands shot up in support. The vote was called. Out of 68 residents present, 61 voted in favor, 7 voted against. 90%. Karen stared at the raised hands like she was watching her entire world collapse. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and walked toward the door. Just before she left, she stopped, looked back at the room, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, You'll regret this. Then she was gone. The room sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then the whole room. Helen walked over to me and shook my hand. Thank you for coming. A lot of us have been afraid of her for years. You gave us the courage to finally do something about it. I nodded. I just wanted to protect my land, but I'm glad it helped. As I walked out of the community center that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not victory, not satisfaction, just relief. The kind that comes when you realize the fight is finally over, and you didn't have to compromise who you were to win it. 2 weeks after the HOA meeting, the final court hearing took place. Judge Sullivan reviewed all the evidence, listened to brief statements from both sides, and rendered her decision without hesitation. Karen's lawsuit was dismissed in full. The judge ruled that I had acted within my legal rights under the Texas Property Code and that Karen had been trespassing when she parked on my property. More than that, Judge Sullivan imposed consequences. Karen was fined $2,000 for criminal trespass under Texas Penal Code 30-05, sentenced to 30 days probation, and ordered to pay me $4,800 in storage fees for the 60 days her disassembled Porsche sat in my garage, plus $22,000 in legal costs. She was also issued a restraining order, barring her from coming within 500 yards of my property for 2 years. But the financial penalty was just the beginning. Beaumont Development LLC lost its permit application when the county reviewed the conflict of interest. 2 major investors pulled out, costing the project $4.5 million in funding. Donald Beaumont was forced to sell 15 of the 120 lots they'd already purchased, taking a 30% loss just to cover debts. Karen had to sell the Porsche after it was reassembled by a specialty shop at a cost of $8,500. She got $145,000 for it, $35,000 less than she'd paid. The legal fees, fines, and financial collapse hit them hard. But the social cost was worse. Karen and Donald became pariahs in Silverwood Estates. Invitations dried up. Neighbors stopped speaking to them. Their reputation was gone. Meanwhile, I used the money from the settlement to upgrade my farm. I installed a new automatic gate, reinforced my fence line, and added 4 more security cameras. The new sign I hung at the entrance was simple. It read, Lone Oak Farm, Est, 1947, private property, protected by law. And just below that, in smaller letters, my land, my rules. I stood at that gate one evening, watching the sun go down over the same fields my grandfather had plowed 70 years ago, and I thought about what my father used to say. Land is the foundation of freedom. Protect it with the law, not with your fists. He was right. The law had been enough. I didn't need violence. I didn't need revenge. I just needed to stand firm, document everything, and let the system do what it was designed to do. This story isn't just about a Porsche or a stubborn HOA president. It's about knowing your rights, standing your ground, and refusing to be bullied just because someone thinks they have power over you. Karen Beaumont learned the hard way that authority without legitimacy is just noise. And when you fight back with the law on your side, the noise stops. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever dealt with someone who thought they could push you around, do me a favor. Support this channel, Karma Clause, where we share real stories about justice, boundaries, and people who refuse to back down. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment about your own experience. And let's keep building a community that believes in standing up for what's right. Because at the end of the day, the best revenge isn't violence or anger. It's watching someone who underestimated you realize they just made the biggest mistake of their life.